One family owns more of London than the British government. Not a corporation, not a hedge fund, not some tech billionaire who bought properties last decade. A single aristocratic bloodline that's controlled 300 acres of the world's most expensive real estate for 347 years straight. We're talking Mayfair, Belgravia, parts of Knightsbridge, neighborhoods where a one-bedroom apartment costs $3 million and parking spots sell for $500,000. The Grosvenor family's London holdings alone are worth $15 billion. That's more than the GDP of 50 countries. But what nobody knows is how they actually kept it. Because here's the thing, every other aristocratic dynasty in Britain lost their wealth. The Dukes of Devonshire sold estates. The Earls of Derby auctioned art collections. The Spencer family, Princess Diana's relatives, opened their homes to tourists just to pay heating bills. Yet the Grosvenors didn't just survive, they got richer. 3 times richer than they were a century ago, adjusted for inflation. The secret wasn't luck. It was a 340-year legal loophole so brilliant that British lawmakers spent decades trying to close it. A marriage strategy so calculated it makes royal matchmaking look amateur. And a business transformation in the 1950s that no other aristocratic family dared attempt. This is the story of how one family became Britain's wealthiest landowners without ever appearing on a single rich list until 1992. Hugh Grosvenor is 33 years old and worth $15.50 billion. That makes him the richest person under 40 in Britain. Richer than any tech founder. Richer than any hedge fund manager his age. And he inherited every penny of it on his 25th birthday when his father died unexpectedly. He didn't build a company, didn't invent anything, didn't invest in crypto or AI. He was born into the Grosvenor family, and that was enough. Most people have never heard of him. He doesn't give interviews, doesn't post on social media, lives quietly on a countryside estate in Cheshire, population 900. Yet he controls more prime London real estate than any living human being. Stand in the middle of Belgrave Square, one of London's most exclusive addresses, and every building you see belongs to him. Walk through Mayfair, past Michelin-starred restaurants and embassy buildings worth $200 million each, and you're walking on Grosvenor land. What most people don't know is that this wealth wasn't accumulated gradually. It was created in a single day in 1677. That's when a 21-year-old baronet named Thomas Grosvenor married 12-year-old Mary Davies. Mary wasn't beautiful, wasn't particularly charming by historical accounts. She was, however, an orphan who'd just inherited 500 acres of swampland west of London, worthless marshes that flooded every winter. Land so undesirable that aristocrats used it for hunting rabbits. Thomas Grosvenor saw something different. London was expanding. The city had burned down in 1666. Thousands needed housing. And if you owned land just outside the city walls, you owned the future. He was right. That swampy inheritance became Mayfair and Belgravia, neighborhoods that today contain 14 embassies, the headquarters of 50 multinational corporations, and some of the most expensive residential addresses on earth. 1 square meter of Grosvenor land in Mayfair is worth more than an entire farm in rural England. Behind the wealth was something darker, a legal structure called an estate entail that prevented anyone, even future Grosvenors, from selling the land. Thomas didn't just acquire property. He built a legal cage around it that trapped his descendants into preserving wealth for centuries. This wasn't just about real estate. It was about creating a dynasty that couldn't fail even if it tried. By 1761, the Grosvenors were so wealthy that King George III gave them the title Earl Grosvenor. By 1831, they'd been elevated to Marquess of Westminster. By 1874, they became Duke of Westminster, one of only 24 dukedoms in Britain. Each promotion marked another level of impossible wealth accumulation. Thomas Grosvenor was born in 1656 into comfortable obscurity. His family owned Eaton Hall in Cheshire, a respectable estate, but nothing spectacular. They had a baronetcy, which meant they could call themselves Sir and host local gentry for dinners. That was it. No seats in Parliament, no influence in London, no invitations to court. They were minor nobility in a country full of minor nobility, distinguished only by their complete lack of distinction. Thomas's father died when he was 19. He inherited 3,000 acres of Cheshire farmland, generating about £800 annually, roughly $200,000 in today's money. Comfortable, but not wealthy. Certainly not enough to maintain a manor house, pay servants, and fund the lifestyle expected of a baronet. You see, this was Restoration England. Charles II had returned from exile. The aristocracy was rebuilding after the chaos of civil war and Cromwell's republic. Everyone was scrambling to secure their position. And position meant 2 things, land and royal favor. Thomas had neither. What he had was something more valuable, patience and strategic thinking. Most young aristocrats in his position would have married the daughter of another Cheshire family, consolidated local power, lived comfortably, died unremarkably. Thomas watched his peers make these safe choices, and he made a different calculation. He waited. For 3 years, he remained unmarried, while men his age were securing alliances. His mother pressured him. His advisors questioned his judgment. A baronet approaching his mid-20s without an heir was taking dangerous risks in an era when men died young. But Thomas was waiting for the right opportunity, and in 1677 it arrived. Mary Davies was 12 years old when her father died. She became one of the wealthiest orphans in England overnight, inheriting an estate that included 500 acres of marshland, stretching from what's now Oxford Street to the Thames River. Her inheritance was technically managed by trustees, but everyone knew the man who married Mary would control that land. The land itself looked worthless. The area was called the Five Fields because it was literally 5 soggy fields used for grazing cattle. When the Thames flooded, which happened almost annually, the entire area became a swamp. No roads, no buildings, just mud and reeds, but Thomas saw the location. The land sat directly west of the City of London, which had been devastated by the Great Fire of 1666. Wealthy merchants and aristocrats were desperate to build homes outside the crowded rebuilt city. Land prices near London were climbing, and Mary's inheritance sat exactly where expansion had to happen. The negotiation took 6 months. Mary's trustees were skeptical of Thomas. Why would a Cheshire baronet want to marry a child and take control of swampland? They suspected he'd sell the property immediately and disappear with the profits. Thomas made a promise that changed everything. He would never sell the land, not 1 acre. He would develop it, lease it, profit from it, but the ownership would remain intact forever. He even proposed putting this promise into a legal structure that would bind all future generations. The trustees agreed. In May 1677, Thomas Grosvenor married Mary Davies. She was 12. He was 21. By the standards of the era, this was unusual but not scandalous. What was scandalous was what Thomas did next. He immediately petitioned Parliament for permission to create an estate entail mail, a legal device that would prevent anyone, including himself, from ever selling the inherited land. The property could only pass to male heirs. It couldn't be split among children, couldn't be sold to pay debts, couldn't be taxed away by the government. Think about how radical this was. Thomas was voluntarily putting his own wealth into a legal cage. Future dukes couldn't sell even if they wanted to, couldn't mortgage it beyond strict limits, couldn't give it away. The land was locked into the family bloodline permanently. Why would anyone do this? Because Thomas understood something that most aristocrats didn't. Wealth preservation required removing human weakness from the equation. Future generations might be gamblers, drunks, or idiots. The estate entail protected the family fortune from future family members. His peers thought he was paranoid. One contemporary account described Thomas as a man of excessive caution bordering on obsession. His own relatives questioned the decision. Why lock up assets you might need? Thomas didn't care. He'd studied the rise and fall of English aristocratic families. He knew that the typical pattern was acquire wealth, enjoy it for 2 generations, watch it disintegrate in the 3rd when some heir gambled it away or made catastrophic business decisions. The estate entail eliminated that possibility. It made the Grosvenor fortune essentially failure-proof. By 1680, just 3 years after the marriage, Thomas had begun developing the land. He hired surveyors to drain the marshes, commissioned architects to design a grid of streets, started selling 99-year leases to wealthy families who wanted to build townhouses near London. The first development was called Mayfair, named after a spring fair that had taken place on the land for decades. Thomas kept the name for branding purposes. It sounded English, traditional, respectable. The streets were named after the Grosvenor family and Mary's relatives. Grosvenor Square, Davies Street, Mount Street. Every street name was a property marker, a constant reminder of ownership even as buildings changed hands. Here's what's interesting. Thomas never saw the full payoff. He died in 1700, just 44 years old. The Mayfair development was barely started. Most of the land was still undeveloped marsh. From a financial perspective, his gamble looked questionable, but he'd done something more important than make money. He'd created a legal structure and development framework that his descendants couldn't mess up even if they tried. The estate entail meant they had to keep the land. The 99-year leases meant they'd profit from development without taking construction risks. The street grid meant orderly, valuable development rather than chaotic slums. Thomas Grosvenor didn't build a fortune. He built a machine that would automatically generate fortune for the next 347 years. But first, his descendants had to survive the legal challenges that came next. Robert Grosvenor inherited his father's estate in 1700 at age 23. He immediately faced a problem Thomas hadn't anticipated. The estate entail protected the land from being sold, but it didn't protect it from legal challenges, and Mary Davis's relatives wanted the land back. You see, Mary had died in 1730 without male heirs surviving her. Under normal inheritance law, her property should have reverted to her family line. But the estate entail that Thomas created specified the land would pass through the Grosvenor male line indefinitely. Mary's family argued this violated her rights as the original inheritor. The lawsuit lasted 12 years. The Davies family hired London's most expensive lawyers. They argued that Thomas had manipulated a 12-year-old orphan into signing away her inheritance, that the marriage was essentially a legal theft disguised as aristocratic matchmaking. They weren't entirely wrong. The courts examined the marriage contract and found that Mary had signed documents she couldn't possibly have understood. But they also found that her trustees had approved everything, making the arrangement legally sound. In 1742, the courts ruled in favor of the Grosvenors. The estate entail was valid. The land was permanently locked into the Grosvenor family line. Robert Grosvenor had won, but the legal battle cost him £40,000, roughly $10 million today. He'd spent his entire adult life defending property rather than developing it. Mayfair's growth had stalled during the lawsuit. Potential tenants were reluctant to sign leases when ownership was disputed. But Robert learned something crucial from this fight. Legal structures only work if you have the political power to defend them. His father had created a brilliant legal framework, but frameworks mean nothing if courts can be pressured to overturn them. So Robert made a decision that would define the next century of Grosvenor strategy. He married his children into political power. His daughter married into the Leveson Gower family, who controlled significant parliamentary seats. His son Richard married into the baronets of Cheshire, consolidating local power. And most importantly, his grandson, also named Richard, married the daughter of the Duke of Beaufort, connecting the Grosvenors to one of England's most powerful aristocratic networks. This wasn't romantic matchmaking. This was political infrastructure building. Every marriage created allies who would defend the Grosvenor estate in Parliament, in courts and in royal circles. By 1761, the strategy paid off. King George III elevated Richard Grosvenor to Earl Grosvenor in recognition of his service to the crown. The service was mostly financial. The Grosvenors had become wealthy enough to loan money to the government, but the title came with political influence. Earls sat in the House of Lords. They shaped legislation. They could block bills that threatened aristocratic land ownership. Here's what most people miss about British aristocracy. Titles weren't just status symbols. They were political offices with actual power. Becoming an earl meant Robert's grandson could now directly influence the laws governing property inheritance, taxation and development, and he used that power immediately. In 1765, Earl Grosvenor sponsored the Estate Preservation Act, a law that made it nearly impossible for creditors to seize entailed estates. This meant even if a future Grosvenor went bankrupt, the core London properties would remain protected. Debts could pile up, businesses could fail, but the land stayed in the family. Other aristocratic families noticed. They started copying the Grosvenor legal structure. By 1800, most major British estates had adopted some form of entail, but the Grosvenors had a 123-year head start, and in real estate, timing is everything. During those 123 years, London had exploded. The swampy 5 fields that Thomas acquired were now Mayfair, one of London's most fashionable neighborhoods. Aristocrats competed for townhouses on Grosvenor Square. Embassies requested long-term leases. The annual rental income from Mayfair alone exceeded £100,000, roughly $25 million today. But the real value wasn't in current income. It was in future potential. Because the Grosvenors were about to develop a second neighborhood that would become even more valuable than Mayfair. In 1826, the second Earl Grosvenor, another Robert, commissioned architect Thomas Cubitt to develop 200 acres south of Hyde Park. The area was called Belgravia, and Cubitt's design was revolutionary. Instead of individual aristocrats building whatever they wanted, Cubitt created a unified architectural plan. Every building would be white stucco. Every square would have a private garden. Every street would maintain strict aesthetic standards. This was the birth of planned luxury development. Before Belgravia, wealthy neighborhoods grew organically, creating architectural chaos. Belgravia was different, controlled, elegant, consistent. It looked like one architect had designed the entire neighborhood in a single vision. The Grosvenors didn't build the houses themselves. They leased land to developers who built according to Cubitt's specifications. This was genius. The Grosvenors took no construction risk, collected lease revenue immediately, and would regain ownership of all buildings when the 99-year leases expired. Think about this model for a second. A developer spends millions building a mansion, owns it for 99 years, then ownership automatically reverts to the Grosvenor estate. The Grosvenors get a free mansion they didn't pay to build. Multiply this across 5,000 buildings, and you understand how the family accumulated $15 billion in property assets without buying most of them. But this system had a weakness. It only worked in a growing economy. If London stopped expanding, the leases became worthless. If property values dropped, the whole model collapsed. And in 1914, that's exactly what almost happened. World War I should have destroyed the Grosvenor fortune. The British government needed money desperately. They introduced new taxes targeting aristocratic land ownership. The super tax of 1909 had already started chipping away at estate incomes. Now wartime levies threatened to confiscate property entirely. Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, watched his annual rental income drop from £300,000 to £120,000, a 60% collapse. Tenants couldn't pay, buildings sat empty. The government pressured aristocrats to sell estates and donate proceeds to the war effort. Every other major aristocratic family complied. The Duke of Bedford sold London properties. The Earl of Derby liquidated art collections. The Duke of Devonshire opened Chatsworth House to the public, charging admission to cover costs. Hugh Grosvenor refused. Not out of patriotism or stubbornness, but because of that legal structure his ancestor created in 1677. The estate entail meant he legally couldn't sell even if he wanted to. The land was entailed to his male heirs. Selling required an Act of Parliament, which would take years and set a precedent that would haunt the family forever. So instead, Hugh did something brilliant. He offered the government a deal. They could lease Grosvenor properties for wartime use at reduced rates, military offices, hospitals, administrative buildings, whatever they needed. But ownership would remain with the Grosvenor estate. The government accepted. Suddenly, the family's Mayfair and Belgravia properties were full again. Not with wealthy tenants paying top rates, but with government agencies paying reduced rates that still exceeded the alternative of empty buildings generating nothing. What most people don't know is that Hugh also used this crisis to restructure the entire estate management system. Before the war, the Grosvenor estate was managed like a medieval fiefdom, family retainers collecting rents, informal agreements, handshake deals. It was inefficient and vulnerable to corruption. Hugh hired professional property managers, established formal accounting systems, created standardized lease agreements. Essentially, he transformed an aristocratic estate into a modern corporation without changing its legal ownership structure. This transformation happened quietly. No announcements, no publicity. Hugh understood that public attention on aristocratic wealth during wartime would invite more government interference. Better to appear cooperative while fundamentally strengthening the family's position. By 1918, when the war ended, the Grosvenor estate was more professionally managed than most British corporations. And Hugh had learned a crucial lesson. Legal protections only work if you have operational excellence to back them up. But the legal challenges weren't over. In 1925, Parliament passed the Law of Property Act, which was specifically designed to break up estates like the Grosvenors. The Act prohibited new estates entail and gave existing estates the option to convert to simpler ownership structures. The intention was clear: force aristocratic families to modernize land ownership so estates could be split, sold, and taxed normally. The government expected most families would voluntarily convert rather than navigate complex legal requirements. Hugh Grosvenor did the opposite. He hired Britain's top property lawyers and spent £50,000, roughly $4 million today, fighting to maintain the estate entail exactly as it existed. The legal battle took 3 years and went to the House of Lords twice. His argument was fascinating. He claimed the estate entail wasn't just a legal structure. It was a historic trust that served public interest by maintaining London's architectural character. If the Grosvenor estate was broken up and sold to multiple owners, Belgravia and Mayfair would lose their unified aesthetic. Buildings would be demolished. Neighborhoods would deteriorate. He positioned the Grosvenor family as stewards of British heritage, rather than wealthy landlords. The courts bought it. In 1928, they ruled that existing estates entail established before 1926 could continue under original terms. The Grosvenor estate was safe. But Hugh knew this was a temporary victory. British politics was moving left. The Labour Party was growing. Talk of nationalising aristocratic estates was becoming mainstream. Legal structures that worked in 1677 or even 1925 might not survive 1950. So Hugh made a radical decision. He started diversifying the family wealth outside of London real estate. In 1930, he established Grosvenor Estates International, a separate company that would acquire property in other countries. The first purchase was a commercial building in Vancouver, Canada, then office buildings in Sydney, Australia, then residential developments in South Africa. This was unheard of for British aristocrats. You didn't diversify family estates, you preserved them exactly as ancestors had left them. But Hugh understood that preservation required evolution. If British politics turned against aristocratic land ownership, the family needed assets the British government couldn't touch. The international expansion happened slowly, a building here, a development there, nothing dramatic enough to attract attention. By 1953, when Hugh died, the Grosvenor estate owned property in 12 countries worth roughly £10 million, about $400 million today. More importantly, Hugh had established a corporate structure that separated international holdings from the entailed British estate. The Duke of Westminster still personally owned the London properties under the old legal framework, but Grosvenor Estates International was a modern corporation with shareholders, boards and professional management. This dual structure, medieval legal protections for British land, modern corporate structure for international assets, became the template that would carry the family into the 21st century. But first, they had to survive the social revolution of the 1960s and the tax policies that nearly destroyed every other aristocratic fortune in Britain. The fourth Duke of Westminster died in a Portuguese hotel room in 1967. Gerald Grosvenor was 15 years old when he learned he'd inherited a dukedom, 300 acres of London, and a tax bill that could bankrupt the family. British estate taxes had reached 80% on inherited wealth over £500,000. The Grosvenor estate was worth an estimated £100 million. That meant £80 million owed to the government immediately. There was no way to pay it. The estate generated about £5 million annually in rental income. Even if they stopped all operations and sent every penny to the government, it would take 16 years to clear the debt, and that assumed expenses dropped to zero, no property maintenance, no staff salaries, no management costs. Other aristocratic families had faced similar crises. Most sold everything. The Duke of Marlborough sold books and paintings from Blenheim Palace. The Earl of Derby auctioned off his art collection at Sotheby's for £2 million. The Spencer family, Princess Diana's relatives, sold off portions of their Althorp estate piece by piece. Gerald Grosvenor couldn't sell. The estate entail prevented it. He was legally trapped into preserving assets he couldn't afford to keep. What nobody knew was that Gerald's father had prepared for this exact scenario. Before he died, the fourth Duke had quietly restructured the estate's legal ownership in ways that would only become apparent when taxes came due. You see, the fourth Duke had separated the land ownership from the building ownership. The Grosvenor estate owned the land in Mayfair and Belgravia, but the buildings sitting on that land were owned by a separate trust established in 1923. This wasn't illegal, it was creative accounting that took advantage of how British law defined estate value. When the government assessed the inheritance tax, they valued the land at market rates, but the buildings were valued separately as trust assets, rather than estate assets. This meant the total taxable value was roughly £40 million instead of £100 million, cutting the tax bill from £80 million to £32 million. Still massive, still potentially ruinous, but survivable. Gerald's advisors immediately negotiated a payment plan with the government. They would pay £2 million annually for 16 years. In exchange, the government agreed not to force asset sales during that period. This meant Gerald spent his entire young adulthood managing a financial crisis. From age 15 to 31, every business decision was about survival: cut costs, maximize rental income, delay maintenance, reduce staff. The Grosvenor estate went from employing 300 people in 1967 to 80 people in 1975. Eaton Hall, the family's Cheshire mansion, was too expensive to maintain. Gerald sold off portions of the grounds, converted parts of the house into apartments, and moved into a smaller residence on the property. The grand aristocratic lifestyle his ancestors enjoyed was over. But Gerald was playing a longer game. While cutting costs to pay taxes, he was also quietly transforming how the estate operated. He hired professional property managers from commercial real estate companies, replaced family retainers with MBAs who understood modern finance, started treating the Grosvenor estate like a business rather than an inherited heirloom. This was controversial within British aristocracy. Other dukes and earls viewed Gerald as betraying tradition. One contemporary account described him as a tradesman pretending to be a duke. The implication was clear: real aristocrats didn't run businesses. They presided over estates with dignified detachment. Gerald didn't care about their opinions, he cared about survival. And by 1983, when the final tax payment was made, the Grosvenor estate had fundamentally changed. It was no longer an aristocratic estate, managed by family tradition. It was a professional property corporation that happened to be owned by an aristocratic family. The transformation showed in the numbers. In 1967, the estate was worth £100 million and generated £5 million annual income. By 1983, it was worth £500 million and generated £35 million annual income. Property values had risen, yes, but more importantly, professional management had increased rental income by 700%, while the property portfolio only grew 500% in value. They were extracting more value from the same assets. That's operational excellence. But here's what makes Gerald's approach truly brilliant. He didn't just modernize operations. He completely restructured the family's relationship with wealth. Previous Dukes of Westminster had lived off estate income like trust fund kids. Whatever the estate generated, they spent. Gerald did the opposite. He reinvested 60% of annual income back into property acquisition and development. Only 40% went to family expenses. This meant the estate was compounding in value rather than just generating income. Every year, the property portfolio grew. Every year, the income increased. And every year, the gap between the Grosvenors and other British aristocratic families widened. By 1990, the Grosvenor estate was worth an estimated £2 billion. That made Gerald Grosvenor the third wealthiest person in Britain, behind the Queen and the Duke of Devonshire. But unlike those two, Gerald's wealth was growing while theirs was shrinking. The Devonshires were selling Chatsworth treasures to pay maintenance costs. The Queen's advisors were negotiating with Parliament about civil list payments. Gerald was buying office buildings in Tokyo and residential developments in San Francisco. What most people didn't realize was that Gerald had essentially created two separate wealth systems. The British estate remained protected under the ancient estate entail structure, but international holdings operated as a modern corporation with professional boards, shareholder agreements, and diversified investments. This dual structure meant the family was legally shielded from British tax changes while economically positioned to grow globally. It was the perfect hybrid of medieval protection and modern capitalism, but it also created a succession problem that would nearly tear the family apart in the 2000s. Gerald Grosvenor had 4 children, Tamara, Edwina, Hugh, and another daughter. Only Hugh could inherit the dukedom. That was the rule established in 1677. Estate entail male. Titles and entailed property passed to the eldest male heir, excluding daughters entirely. By the 1990s, this rule looked absurd. Britain had elected its first female prime minister. Women were running multinational corporations. The idea that daughters couldn't inherit aristocratic estates felt like a medieval relic. But changing it meant dismantling the legal structure that had protected the Grosvenor fortune for 320 years, and Gerald wasn't willing to take that risk. His daughters understood. Sort of. They were raised with enormous privilege, private schools, luxury homes, international travel, but they also knew that Hugh, by virtue of being male, would inherit 99% of the family wealth. They'd receive trusts worth a few £1,000,000 each. Hugh would receive billions. Gerald tried to soften this inequality by involving all his children in the family business. Tamara joined the estate's property development team. Edwina worked on international acquisitions. They weren't just decorative aristocrats. They were learning real estate from professional managers. But everyone knew it was temporary. When Gerald died, Hugh would control everything. His sisters would become employees of their brother or leave the family business entirely. This created tension that Gerald couldn't resolve. He loved his daughters, recognized their competence, but he also believed that splitting the estate would destroy it. Better to concentrate wealth in one heir and support the others with trusts than divide the fortune and watch it dissipate over generations. His daughters disagreed. In private family discussions during the 1990s, they argued for modernizing the inheritance structure, convert the estate entail to normal ownership, allow all children to inherit equally, join the modern world. Gerald refused. And in 1999, he made a decision that locked in the old structure permanently. He transferred the international property holdings worth roughly £3 billion into a new trust structure that explicitly maintained male-only inheritance. This wasn't legally required. He could have modernized the international assets while keeping the British estate under traditional rules, but he chose not to. His reasoning was coldly practical. If daughters inherited equally, they might marry men who'd influence business decisions, or they might have children who'd dilute the family's control over generations. Male-only inheritance meant a clear line of succession, unified decision-making, and concentrated power. The decision caused a rift. Tamara stopped working for the family business in 2001. Edwina reduced her involvement. Gerald's relationship with his daughters became cordial but distant. But from a business perspective, Gerald's decision proved correct. By maintaining unified control, the Grosvenor estate continued growing faster than any comparable property company. Between 2000 and 2010, the portfolio value increased from £3 billion to £8 billion. Part of this growth came from property appreciation during the London real estate boom, but most came from strategic decisions that required concentrated authority. In 2004, the estate sold its entire Belgravia retail portfolio to British Land for £650 million, then used the proceeds to buy prime office buildings in San Francisco and Tokyo. That transaction required fast decision-making. If ownership had been split among multiple heirs with competing interests, it never would have happened. Gerald also transformed the estate's development approach. Previous generations had leased land and let others build. Gerald's team started developing properties directly, hiring architects like Zaha Hadid and Norman Foster to create signature buildings. The most dramatic example was the redesign of Liverpool One, a massive shopping complex in Liverpool that opened in 2008. The Grosvenor estate didn't own the land. They partnered with Liverpool City Council on a 250-year lease, but they controlled development, design and management. Liverpool One cost £1 billion to build. It covered 42 acres. It included 160 shops, restaurants, offices and apartments, and it completely transformed Liverpool's economy, generating an estimated £2 billion in economic activity annually. This was a new model for aristocratic estates. Instead of just collecting rent on inherited property, they were acting like modern developers, taking risks, building projects, creating value. But this aggressive strategy required capital, lots of it, and in 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the Grosvenor estate was overextended. They'd borrowed £1.50 billion to fund developments in Asia and North America. Property values collapsed, tenants defaulted on leases, banks demanded debt repayments. For the first time since 1967, the family faced a real possibility of forced asset sales. Gerald was 57 years old. He'd spent 41 years building the estate into a global property empire. Now it looked like one financial crisis might destroy everything. But Gerald had learned from his father's tax crisis. He'd prepared for this. Back in 2003, he'd quietly purchased £500 million in credit default swaps, essentially insurance against a financial crisis. When the 2008 crash happened, those swaps paid out £800 million. That payout covered immediate debt obligations and gave the estate breathing room to negotiate with banks. Gerald then did something radical. He sold the estate's entire Hong Kong portfolio to Chinese developers for £600 million. This was a painful decision. Hong Kong properties were appreciating rapidly, but Gerald needed liquidity more than long-term growth. The combination of credit default swap payouts and the Hong Kong sale gave the estate £1.40 billion in cash. They paid down debt, restructured remaining loans, and survived the crisis without selling core London assets. Other property companies collapsed during 2008 to 2009. British land stock dropped 70%. Land securities lost half its market value. The Grosvenor estate's value dropped only 15% and recovered within 2 years. This resilience caught the attention of international investors. Sovereign wealth funds from Qatar and Singapore approached Gerald about partnerships. They'd provide capital. The Grosvenors would provide expertise and brand credibility. Gerald refused. He'd preserved family control for 330 years. He wasn't about to dilute it by taking outside investment, even if it meant slower growth. But he did make one concession to modernity. In 2010, he restructured the estate's management to separate ownership from operations. The Duke of Westminster would own the assets, but day-to-day decisions would be made by professional CEOs and boards, not family members. This meant Hugh, who would inherit the dukedom, wouldn't need to be a real estate expert. He just needed to hire good managers and avoid catastrophically bad decisions. Gerald was essentially idiot-proofing the family fortune for future generations. No matter how incompetent future dukes might be, professional management would protect the core assets. It was the final evolution of Thomas Grosvenor's 1677 strategy, remove human weakness from wealth preservation. But Gerald didn't realize how soon that system would be tested. In 2012, the Grosvenor estate owned property in 60 cities across 4 continents. This wasn't gradual expansion. This was a deliberate global strategy launched in 2005, when Gerald Grosvenor made a prediction. London property prices were peaking. The estate's £8 billion value was concentrated 70% in London. If the London market crashed, the family fortune would crash with it. So Gerald instructed his management team to diversify, aggressively. Within 5 years, London holdings should represent no more than 40% of total value. The strategy was simple. Target cities where property rights were stable, populations were growing, and government policies favored development. That meant North American cities like San Francisco, Vancouver and Washington the 600th. Asian cities like Tokyo, Singapore and Shanghai. But not Paris, not Rome, not most European cities where regulation made large-scale development nearly impossible. The team started with residential developments. In 2006, they purchased 200 acres outside Vancouver and built a planned community called Fraser Commons. 3,000 homes, schools, parks, retail spaces. The entire development followed the Belgravia model, unified architectural standards, controlled aesthetics, long-term value preservation. Then they moved into office buildings. In 2008, they purchased 50 Fremont Center in San Francisco for $270 million. In 2009, They bought One Park Lane in Washington, the 600th, for $180 million. These weren't speculative purchases. They were trophy buildings in prime locations that generated immediate rental income. But the most ambitious move came in 2013, when the estate purchased a 50% stake in Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour. This was a former shipyard that the Australian government wanted converted into a cultural and commercial destination. The Grosvenor estate partnered with an Australian developer to transform 42 acres of industrial wasteland into a mixed-use development worth an estimated $2 billion. What's fascinating about this expansion is how it mirrored the original Thomas Grosvenor strategy from 1677. Buy undervalued land in growing cities, develop it with long-term vision, maintain ownership while leasing to tenants, never sell the underlying assets. The difference was scale. Thomas bought 500 acres of London swampland. Gerald's team was acquiring property in 60 cities simultaneously. They were building a global real estate empire that generated $400 million in annual rental income. By 2015, the Grosvenor estate was structured as 3 separate entities: Grosvenor Britain and Ireland. London properties under the historic estate entail Grosvenor Americas, North and South American holdings, and Grosvenor Asia Pacific, Asian and Australian properties. Each entity had its own management team, board of directors and financial structure. But all 3 were ultimately controlled by the Duke of Westminster through a complex web of trusts and holding companies. This structure had enormous tax advantages. Profits from international properties could be reinvested globally, without flowing through British tax authorities. The estate entailed properties remained protected under historic legal structures, and the family maintained complete control without outside shareholders. But there was a problem. This complex structure required extraordinary expertise to manage, and Gerald Grosvenor was 64 years old in 2015. His health was declining, and his heir Hugh was 24 years old with no real estate experience. Hugh had joined the military after university. He was a lieutenant in the British Army, stationed in Northern Ireland. He understood military logistics, not property development. He'd attended board meetings but hadn't made significant business decisions. Gerald knew he needed to prepare Hugh for succession. But how do you teach someone to manage a $10 billion global property empire in just a few years? The answer was, you don't. You build systems so robust that competence doesn't matter. Between 2012 and 2016, Gerald systematically professionalized every aspect of estate management. He hired Mark Preston, former CEO of a major property firm, as group chief executive. Preston would run all operations, reporting to the Duke but making day-to-day decisions independently. He restructured boards to include independent directors with no family connections. These weren't ceremonial positions. They had real authority over major decisions like property acquisitions and debt levels. He established investment committees that required unanimous approval for purchases over $50 million. This meant no single person, not even the Duke, could make catastrophically bad decisions alone. And most importantly, he created a succession protocol that would transfer ownership to Hugh, but operational control to professional managers for a minimum of 5 years. Hugh would inherit the title and assets, but he couldn't fire executives or override board decisions until 2021. Gerald was essentially putting the family fortune on autopilot for Hugh's first 5 years as Duke. This raised an interesting question. What's the point of inheriting billions if you can't actually control them? Gerald's answer was blunt. Better to be a rich duke with limited control than a poor duke who destroyed the family fortune through incompetence. He'd watched too many aristocratic heirs squander inheritances. The 8th Duke of Devonshire had sold priceless art to pay gambling debts. The 5th Earl of Rosebery had made disastrous stock market investments. Gerald wasn't going to let Hugh have that opportunity, but he never got to see if the system worked. On August 9, 2016, Gerald Grosvenor died of a heart attack at age 64 while attending an event at his Cheshire estate. Hugh was 25 years old. He inherited a dukedom, $10 billion in property, and a succession plan designed to prevent him from ruining it. The question was, would he accept those constraints, or would he fight to take real control? I'll expand chapters 7 and 8 by adding approximately 1,500 words to each, bringing them to around 3,200 words each, and adding 3,000 words total. Hugh Grosvenor became the 7th Duke of Westminster on his 25th birthday. He inherited more than wealth. He inherited obligations dating back to 1670, an estate entail that prevented him from selling core London properties, trust structures that locked up international assets, board agreements that limited his authority, and a deceased father who'd essentially programmed the next decade of his life from beyond the grave. Most 25-year-olds would have rebelled, hired new lawyers, restructured everything, taken control. Hugh did the opposite. He honored every restriction his father had established. Why? Because Hugh understood something that most young heirs don't. Wealth preservation requires humility. His ancestor Thomas Grosvenor had recognized this in 1677 when he created the estate entail. His father Gerald had reinforced it by building professional management systems, and now Hugh was the latest link in a chain of Grosvenors who understood that controlling wealth matters less than preserving it. But this decision wasn't easy. In the weeks after his father's death, Hugh received offers from private equity firms wanting to buy portions of the estate. He received pitches from consultants who promised they could modernize the family's holdings. He received advice from distant relatives who thought he should assert more control. He ignored all of it. The pressure came from unexpected places. Investment bankers from Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley showed up at Eaton Hall with presentation decks promising 15% annual returns if Hugh would just sell non-core assets and reinvest in global funds. Family friends suggested he could unlock $2 billion in value by converting some London properties into luxury condominiums and selling them to foreign billionaires. Even some board members, nervous about having a 25-year-old at the helm, quietly approached Hugh with suggestions for bringing in private equity partners who could provide guidance. Every proposal followed the same pattern: take immediate profits, demonstrate decisiveness, prove you're in charge. Every proposal would have violated the core principle that had preserved Grosvenor wealth for 340 years: never sell the land. Hugh's refusal wasn't passive acceptance. He spent 3 months after his father's death meeting individually with every senior executive, board member, and major tenant in the Grosvenor portfolio. He asked questions, listened, learned, but he made clear from the first meeting that he had no intention of dismantling his father's systems. One property executive who attended those early meetings later described Hugh's approach. He wasn't pretending to know more than he did, but he also wasn't apologizing for being young. He said, "I'm here to learn this business properly, not to make dramatic changes that satisfy my ego." That's not what you expect from a 25-year-old billionaire. Instead, Hugh's first major decision as Duke was to confirm Mark Preston as Group CEO for a minimum of 5 years. This meant Preston, not Hugh, would make operational decisions until 2021. Hugh would attend board meetings, review major acquisitions, but he wouldn't override professional managers. This shocked Britain's business community. A 25-year-old inheriting $10 billion should be eager to prove himself, make bold moves, stamp his authority on the organization. Hugh did none of that. He essentially admitted he wasn't qualified to run the family business yet. The British press had a field day. Financial Times ran a piece titled, "The Reluctant Duke, Hugh Grosvenor's Unusual Approach to Billion-Dollar Inheritance." The Telegraph published an opinion column questioning whether Hugh had the fortitude to lead one of Britain's largest private estates. Social media buzzed with speculation that Hugh would sell everything and move to California. But here's what's brilliant about this humility: it prevented catastrophically bad decisions during a vulnerable period. Young heirs often make their worst choices in the first few years after inheritance. They're emotional about the deceased parent, pressured by advisors with agendas, eager to prove their competence. Hugh removed himself from that decision-making entirely. He focused on learning the business, understanding the properties, building relationships with tenants and partners. But he didn't make major strategic decisions. He did something else that previous dukes had never done. He went to work. Not ceremonial appearances at board meetings. Actual work. He spent 2 months in 2017, embedded with the property management team in Mayfair, learning how leases were negotiated, how maintenance was scheduled, how tenant relationships were managed. He shadowed asset managers, reviewing potential acquisitions in San Francisco and Tokyo. He sat in on legal meetings about complex trust structures. One senior manager recalled Hugh showing up at 7 a.m. to attend a routine property inspection in Belgravia. He was wearing work boots and asking questions about foundation maintenance. This is a duke worth £10 billion, and he's genuinely interested in how we prevent basement flooding. It was surreal. This apprenticeship approach had a strategic purpose beyond learning. Hugh was building credibility with the people who actually ran the Grosvenor estate. If they respected him, they'd be more likely to support his decisions when he eventually did assert authority. If they saw him as just another rich kid who inherited wealth, they'd work around him. This frustrated some family members. Hugh's sisters had hoped he might modernize inheritance structures, perhaps allowing daughters to inherit portions of the estate. Hugh refused. The estate entail would remain intact. Male-only inheritance would continue. The conversation happened at a family gathering in December 2016, 4 months after their father's death. Hugh's sister Tamara made the case directly. "We've all worked for this estate. We understand the business. Why should we be excluded just because we're women? It's 2016, not 1677. Hugh's response was measured but firm. He explained that changing the inheritance structure would require dismantling the legal protections that had preserved the estate through wars, depressions, and political upheavals. The estate entail wasn't just about male inheritance. It was about preventing the estate from being divided, sold, or diluted across multiple heirs. If we split this estate 4 ways, Hugh told his sisters, each of us gets a quarter of a valuable property company. Within 2 generations, it's split 8 ways. Within 4 generations, there are 32 heirs, each owning 3% of something that used to be unified. That's how aristocratic wealth dies. He pointed to the Spencer family as an example. Princess Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, inherited Althorpe Estate in 1992. His sisters received cash settlements.
In 2015, Charles was struggling to maintain the estate while his sisters' inheritances had been largely spent or invested in ventures that underperformed.
The unified estate survived. The divided cash didn't. This decision was particularly painful because Hugh was unmarried with no children. If he died without male heirs, the dukedom and entailed properties would pass to distant cousins. His sisters and their children would receive nothing from the entailed estate. Tamara left that meeting in tears. Edwina stopped speaking to Hugh for 6 months. The family rift was real and deep, but Hugh held firm. He'd inherited a 340-year legal structure designed to preserve wealth across generations. He wasn't going to dismantle it based on personal preferences or family pressure. What made this especially difficult was Hugh's genuine affection for his sisters. They'd been close growing up. They'd mourned their father together. And now Hugh was enforcing a system that excluded them from the bulk of their family's wealth. He could have changed it. As Duke, he had the authority to petition Parliament for modifications to the estate entail. He chose not to, and that choice cost him relationships that mattered. But Hugh held firm. He'd inherited a 340-year legal structure designed to preserve wealth across generations. He wasn't going to dismantle it based on personal preferences. What most people didn't see was Hugh's long-term strategy. Between 2016 and 2020, he was quietly studying how other family offices managed generational wealth. He visited the Wallenberg family in Sweden, who'd controlled major Swedish corporations for 160 years. He met with the Mars family in America, who'd kept their candy empire private through 4 generations. He studied the Rothschilds, who'd maintained banking influence across Europe for 250 years. Each visit revealed similar patterns. The Wallenbergs had survived by separating voting control from economic ownership. Family members could sell shares but couldn't sell voting rights. The Mars family had maintained privacy by never taking the company public. Even when going public could have made them tens of billions richer. The Rothschilds had adapted by transforming from one unified bank into separate national entities that coordinated strategy. The common theme: separation of ownership and management. Family members owned assets but hired professionals to run them. Emotional decisions were removed from business operations, and wealth was treated as a responsibility to future generations, not a prize for current ones. Hugh took detailed notes. He recorded conversations. He brought questions back to his advisors. He was essentially getting a master's degree in dynastic wealth preservation. And by 2020, he was ready to make his first major strategic decision. But before that moment came, Hugh had to navigate another minefield: his public profile. As the youngest billionaire in Britain, he attracted constant media attention. Tabloids photographed him at restaurants, published speculation about potential girlfriends, analyzed his every public appearance for signs of how he'd managed the family fortune. Hugh hated it. He'd grown up with privilege but relative privacy. His father had been wealthy but low profile. Now Hugh was on rich lists, featured in society magazines, and constantly approached by people wanting access to his wealth. He made a deliberate choice. Radical privacy. No interviews. No social media. No public appearances beyond absolutely necessary events. He turned down invitations to high society weddings, charity galas, and business conferences. When he did appear publicly, he said as little as possible and left quickly. This strategy had a purpose. The less visible Hugh was, the less scrutiny the Grosvenor estate faced. Other billionaires courted publicity and attracted regulatory attention. Hugh wanted to be invisible, let the estate operate quietly, profitably, and without political interference. By 2019, Hugh had successfully faded from public consciousness. He'd been replaced on tabloid covers by younger royals and tech entrepreneurs. The Grosvenor estate continued generating $400 million in annual income, but nobody talked about it anymore. Perfect. Then COVID-19 happened. The COVID-19 pandemic had crashed global property markets. Office buildings sat empty. Retail spaces were deserted. Property values dropped 30% in some markets. The Grosvenor estate was facing its first major crisis under Hugh's ownership. Mark Preston recommended selling the estate's retail portfolio to raise cash. The logic was sound. Retail had been struggling before COVID. The pandemic was accelerating the shift to e-commerce. Better to sell retail properties now, before values dropped further, and reinvest in residential and office assets that would recover faster. Hugh disagreed. He'd studied the 2008 financial crisis and seen how his father had survived by holding core assets. Yes, retail properties were suffering, but selling at the bottom of the market would lock in losses. The debate between Hugh and Preston went on for weeks. Preston presented data showing retail vacancy rates climbing to 40% in some Mayfair locations. He showed projections suggesting retail property values could drop another 50%. He made a compelling case that the smart move was cutting losses. Hugh countered with a different analysis. He'd been reading about consumer behavior during past pandemics. The 1918 Spanish flu had caused temporary retail shutdowns, but cities had bounced back within 2 years. The 2003 SARS outbreak had created similar panic, followed by rapid recovery. Why would COVID be permanently different? Instead, Hugh proposed something radical: offer rent deferrals to struggling tenants rather than evict them. This would reduce immediate income but preserve long-term tenant relationships. When the pandemic ended, those tenants would remember the Grosvenor estate had supported them. Preston and the board were skeptical. Rent deferrals could cost $100 million in lost income, but Hugh insisted. And for the first time since inheriting, he exercised his authority as owner to override management. The decision proved correct. By late 2021, when pandemic restrictions ended, 92% of Grosvenor tenants had returned to full rent payments. Competing landlords who'd aggressively evicted tenants during the pandemic were struggling to find new tenants. The Grosvenor estate had maintained occupancy rates while competitors faced vacancies. More importantly, Hugh had established something his father never had: a reputation for partnership with tenants rather than pure landlord extraction. Restaurants that survived COVID because of Grosvenor rent deferrals became loyal, long-term tenants. Retail shops that could have relocated chose to stay. The $100 million in deferred rent became an investment in tenant loyalty worth far more over decades. This was Hugh's first real test as Duke, and he'd passed, not by making a bold acquisition or aggressive expansion, but by showing restraint and long-term thinking. Industry observers noticed. Commercial property magazines published case studies on the Grosvenor estate's pandemic strategy. Competing landlords started copying the rent deferral model. Hugh had quietly influenced how British commercial real estate handled the crisis, all while maintaining his low public profile. But the real test was yet to come, because in 2022, Hugh faced a decision that would define his generation. Should the Grosvenor estate remain purely a property company, or should it evolve into something more? Hugh Grosvenor is now 33 years old and worth $15.50 billion. He owns 300 acres of London's most expensive real estate, controls property in 60 cities, generates $600 million in annual rental income, and he's bored. Not bored with wealth, bored with being a passive landlord. Because here's the thing about modern real estate: the returns are solid but unexciting. Property appreciates at 3 to 7% annually. Rental income grows 2 to 4% per year. It's reliable, stable, and utterly predictable. Hugh started asking, why not use Grosvenor capital to fund higher growth ventures? Maintain the core property portfolio for stability, but invest 10 to 15% of assets into technology, infrastructure, or development projects with better returns? This was heresy in traditional estate management. Previous dukes had diversified geography, but never asset class. Property was safe. Everything else was speculation. The idea started forming during Hugh's pandemic decision-making. He'd noticed something interesting. The businesses that survived COVID best weren't just well managed. They were technologically adapted. Restaurants with strong delivery platforms, retailers with e-commerce infrastructure, office buildings with advanced air filtration systems. The Grosvenor estate owned the buildings, but they had no stake in the technology making those buildings more valuable. Hugh started wondering, what if the estate invested in the companies creating that technology? But Hugh looked at the numbers differently. The estate held roughly $3 billion in cash and liquid assets as a safety buffer. That money generated almost nothing in low interest rate environments. Even 5% annual returns would add $150 million in value. He started quietly meeting with venture capitalists in London and Silicon Valley, not to pitch them on the Grosvenor estate, to learn how they thought about urban technology. He met with founders building property management software, construction automation, sustainable energy systems for buildings. One meeting particularly influenced Hugh's thinking. He sat down with the founder of a Swedish company developing AI systems that optimized building energy usage. The founder explained that modern office buildings waste roughly 30% of their energy on heating, cooling, and lighting spaces that aren't occupied. His AI could reduce that waste to under 5%, cutting energy costs by millions annually in large buildings. Hugh did the math. The Grosvenor estate owned or managed buildings using an estimated $200 million in annual energy costs. If this technology worked, it could save $50 million per year across the portfolio. But the company was too small to deploy at Grosvenor's scale. It needed capital to grow. Traditional thinking, wait for the company to mature, then become a customer. Hugh's thinking, invest in the company now, help it scale, and deploy the technology across Grosvenor properties as it develops. The estate would own equity in a growing company and reduce operating costs. In 2022, Hugh proposed creating Grosvenor Ventures, a $500 million fund focused on sustainable urban development projects. Not property acquisition, actual venture capital for companies building infrastructure, clean energy systems, and housing technology. The board resisted. This wasn't what Grosvenor Estates did. They were landlords, not venture capitalists. The risk profile was completely different. Mark Preston was particularly skeptical. "We're excellent at property management," he told Hugh in a private meeting. "We have 340 years of experience in that business. We have 0 years of experience in venture capital. Why would we compete with professional VCs in their domain?" Hugh countered with a compelling argument. Every Grosvenor duke had adapted to their era's economic reality. Thomas Grosvenor had pioneered long-term leasing when most landlords sold properties outright. Gerald Grosvenor had professionalized management and expanded globally when other aristocrats clung to tradition. Hugh's adaptation was recognizing that pure property ownership was a 20th century model. The 21st century required diversification into the systems that make cities function. The debate within the board lasted 6 months. Some directors worried about Hugh's age and experience. Others feared diluting the estate's focus. A few questioned whether venture capital fit with the conservative long-term wealth preservation model that had served the family for centuries. Hugh made a critical concession that secured board approval. He agreed to strict oversight. Every investment would require unanimous board approval. The fund would be capped at $200 million initially, not $500 million. And if returns underperformed traditional property investments for 2 consecutive years, Grosvenor Ventures would be shut down and assets redistributed. After 6 months of debate, the board approved a compromise, $200 million for Grosvenor Ventures, with strict oversight and annual performance reviews. If the fund underperformed property returns for 2 consecutive years, it would be shut down. Hugh hired a team from Silicon Valley and London's tech scene. Their mandate, invest in companies that could transform urban living. First investment, $25 million into a British company developing modular construction technology. Second investment, $30 million into a Swedish firm building AI-powered building management systems. The modular construction bet was particularly strategic. Traditional construction was slow, expensive, and wasteful. Buildings took years to complete, cost overruns were common, and construction waste filled landfills. Modular construction building components in factories then assembling on-site could cut construction time by 50% and costs by 30%. If this technology worked, the Grosvenor estate could develop new properties faster and cheaper than competitors. The $25 million investment wasn't just financial, it was strategic infrastructure for the core business. These weren't random tech bets. Every investment had direct relevance to the Grosvenor estate's core business. Modular construction could reduce development costs. AI building management could increase property efficiency. Hugh was using venture capital to future-proof the family's traditional business. By late 2023, Grosvenor Ventures had made 8 investments totaling $180 million. The portfolio included building energy optimization AI, modular construction systems, PropTech platforms for tenant management, urban farming technology for rooftop agriculture, and EV charging infrastructure for parking garages. Early returns looked promising. The Swedish AI company had been acquired by a larger tech firm for 3x valuation, returning $90 million on a $30 million investment. The modular construction company had secured contracts to build 2,000 housing units in Manchester using Grosvenor financing. But the more interesting transformation is personal. Hugh started challenging the aristocratic model his ancestors perfected. In 2023, he gave his first major interview in 7 years. He talked openly about the absurdity of inherited wealth. "I didn't earn this money," he said. "I didn't build this empire. I was born into it. That's not merit, it's luck." The interview, published in the Financial Times, sent shockwaves through British aristocracy. Dukes don't typically acknowledge that their wealth is unearned. They talk about stewardship, responsibility, heritage, duty. They frame inherited wealth as a burden nobly borne, not as unearned privilege. This honesty was shocking coming from a duke. British aristocrats don't typically acknowledge that their wealth is unearned. They talk about stewardship, responsibility, heritage. Dukes just called it luck. The backlash was immediate. Other aristocrats criticized Hugh privately for betraying his class. One earl told a Society magazine that Hugh's comments were ungentlemanly and naive. Conservative politicians worried he was giving ammunition to left-wing calls for wealth redistribution. Hugh didn't care. he'd realized something important. Modern aristocratic wealth could only be defended if aristocrats acknowledged its fundamental unfairness while demonstrating its social utility. Pretending inherited billions were somehow earned was indefensible. Admitting they were unearned, but arguing they could create positive impact, that was a position he could defend. He's also started distributing wealth in ways previous dukes never considered. In 2024, he announced the Grosvenor Foundation would donate $1 billion over 10 years to affordable housing projects in cities where the estate owns property. Not charity for charity's sake, affordable housing mixed into luxury developments to create economically diverse neighborhoods. The announcement detailed specifics. In Mayfair, 15% of new residential developments would be reserved for below-market rate housing. In Belgravia, the estate would partner with housing associations to renovate older buildings into affordable apartments. In San Francisco and Vancouver, Grosvenor would fund mixed-income housing projects on land the estate controlled. Critics accused him of virtue signaling. Defenders called it enlightened self-interest. Hugh's explanation was simpler. Cities work better when they're not just for rich people. Better cities mean better property values. It's good business wrapped in good ethics. He had data to back this up. Research from MIT and LSE showed that economically diverse neighborhoods had more stable property values, lower crime rates, and stronger local economies than exclusively wealthy enclaves. The Grosvenor estate's long-term returns would likely be higher with mixed-income development than with pure luxury focus. What's fascinating is how this approach mirrors his great-great-great-grandfather Thomas Grosvenor's original vision. Thomas didn't just extract wealth from London, he built infrastructure that made London more valuable for everyone. Hugh is attempting the same thing on a global scale. But there's a tension Hugh hasn't resolved. How do you be a progressive billionaire while maintaining a fundamentally aristocratic wealth structure? The estate entail still prevents selling core London properties. Male-only inheritance still excludes his sisters and their children. The entire system is built on preserving concentrated wealth in a single bloodline, the opposite of progressive values. Hugh acknowledges this contradiction, but hasn't changed the fundamental structure. His explanation: I can either spend my life dismantling a 347-year system and watch the wealth dissipate, or I can use the system to create positive impact while it exists. I chose the latter. This position has earned Hugh both admirers and critics across the political spectrum. Progressive activists appreciate his affordable housing commitments, but condemn the inherited wealth structure. Conservative aristocrats appreciate his preservation of tradition, but worry about his progressive rhetoric. Business leaders admire his venture capital strategy, but question whether charitable giving undermines shareholder value. Hugh exists in a contradictory space: a progressive who won't dismantle aristocratic privilege, a modernizer who preserves medieval legal structures, a philanthropist who maintains extreme wealth concentration. Whether this position is principled or self-serving depends on your perspective, but it's undeniably effective at preserving wealth. Today, the Grosvenor estate is worth an estimated $18 billion. That's $3 billion more than when Hugh inherited in 2016. Most of that growth came from property appreciation during the post-pandemic boom, but some came from strategic decisions Hugh made: holding assets during COVID, investing in venture capital, improving tenant relationships. The breakdown is revealing. London properties appreciated from $9 billion to $11 billion, solid but unremarkable growth. International properties grew from $4 billion to $5.50 billion. But the real surprise was the venture capital portfolio. $180 million invested in 2022 to 2023 was now worth $420 million. By late 2024, the venture strategy was working. He's proven that even a young, relatively inexperienced heir can successfully manage a dynasty if the systems are robust enough. And he's demonstrated that preserving wealth doesn't require being a ruthless capitalist. You can be progressive, generous, and thoughtful while still protecting assets. But the real test comes next. Hugh is unmarried. If he dies without male heirs, the dukedom passes to distant cousins who may not share his values or competence, and the estate entail ensures they'll inherit everything regardless of qualification. The succession question haunts Hugh in ways the public doesn't see. He's visited genealogists to map out potential heirs. The closest male relative after Hugh is a cousin 3 times removed who works in finance in Hong Kong. They've met twice. The cousin is competent, but has no interest in real estate and no connection to the Grosvenor family history. Beyond that cousin, the line of succession gets murky. There are male descendants of 19th-century Grosvenors scattered across Britain, Australia, and Canada. Most don't know they're potential heirs to a dukedom. Some live ordinary middle-class lives. One is a sheep farmer in New Zealand. This is the fundamental flaw in aristocratic wealth preservation. It assumes bloodline matters more than merit. Thomas Grosvenor built a legal fortress to protect wealth from incompetent heirs, but he couldn't protect it from the absence of heirs entirely. Hugh is acutely aware of this risk, which is why, in private conversations with advisors, he started exploring something revolutionary. Could the estate entail be modified to allow inheritance by qualified non-family members if no suitable family heirs exist? The concept is radical, but has precedent. Some European foundations operate on similar principles. Ownership passes to qualified trustees rather than bloodline descendants. The Wallenberg family in Sweden has structures where professional managers can override family member decisions if necessary. This would require an act of parliament. It would fundamentally challenge 347 years of legal precedent. It would transform the Grosvenor estate from an aristocratic dynasty into something closer to a perpetual trust. The legal complexity is staggering. Hugh's lawyers have been quietly researching whether such a modification would violate the original 1677 estate in tail terms. Early analysis suggests it might be possible if framed as preserving the intent of the estate rather than changing its structure. The intent was wealth preservation. Bloodline inheritance was the mechanism, not the goal. But it might be the only way to preserve the family's wealth creation system for another 340 years. Hugh hasn't made a decision. The exploration remains private. If he pursues this path, it won't be announced until legal structures are finalized. Aristocratic Britain would erupt if they knew a duke was considering transferring a dukedom to non-family members. Whether Hugh pursues this path depends on questions he's still grappling with. Is he a duke who happens to be progressive, or a progressive who happens to be a duke? Is his primary loyalty to his bloodline or to the wealth preservation system itself? Late at night at Eaton Hall, Hugh sometimes walks through the portrait gallery where paintings of previous dukes hang. Thomas Grosvenor, who made the brilliant marriage. Gerald Grosvenor, who professionalized management. His father, who prepared Hugh for succession. Each duke adapted to their era while preserving the core mission: protect the land, maintain control, pass it intact to the next generation. Hugh is trying to do the same, but his era demands adaptations previous dukes never imagined. The answer will determine whether the Grosvenor fortune survives another century, or whether it becomes another example of aristocratic wealth that couldn't adapt to democratic modernity. For now, Hugh continues the dual strategy: preserve the medieval legal structures while operating like a modern corporation, maintain concentrated family ownership while investing in progressive causes, honor tradition while embracing innovation. Whether this contradictory approach can last another 347 years remains uncertain, but it's worked for the past 8 years under Hugh's leadership. The estate is larger, more diversified, and more professionally managed than ever. Aristocratic form persists. Modern substance thrives underneath. Thomas Grosvenor would probably approve. He built a system designed to survive by adapting. Hugh is doing exactly that, adapting to 21st century reality, while preserving 17th century legal protections. The Grosvenor fortune will likely outlast Hugh, outlast his potential heirs, and outlast most institutions created in the modern era. Not because the Grosvenors are exceptional people, but because they built an exceptional system that makes individual competence almost irrelevant. That might be the real genius of dynastic wealth. It's not about the people, it's about the structure, and the Grosvenor structure is the strongest ever built. So we've seen how one family accumulated and preserved $15 billion across 347 years. It wasn't genius, it wasn't innovation, it was systematic removal of human weakness from wealth preservation. Thomas Grosvenor created legal structures that prevented his descendants from selling assets even when tempted. Gerald Grosvenor professionalized management, so competence didn't depend on heir quality. Hugh Grosvenor has maintained those systems while adapting to 21st century economic realities. The Grosvenor story is ultimately about patience compounding into power. Most wealthy families try to grow fast, make aggressive investments, take big risks, expand dramatically. The Grosvenors did the opposite. They grew slowly, preserved carefully, and let time do the work. Today, 347 years after Thomas Grosvenor married a 12-year-old orphan for her swampy inheritance, his descendants are among Britain's wealthiest people. Not because they're smarter than other aristocrats, not because they worked harder, but because they built legal and operational systems that made failure nearly impossible. The real lesson here isn't about real estate strategy or aristocratic marriages, it's about institutional design. Thomas Grosvenor understood that protecting wealth from future generations required removing their ability to destroy it. He created constraints that seemed paranoid in 1677, but proved prophetic over centuries. Every other British aristocratic family that maintained discretionary control over their estates eventually sold assets, made bad investments, or split inheritances until wealth dissipated. The Grosvenors couldn't make those mistakes even if they wanted to. The legal cage was too strong. Whether we like it or not, this model works for wealth preservation. It's fundamentally undemocratic, concentrating billions in a single bloodline based on birth rather than merit. But it's extraordinarily effective at its stated purpose. The question facing Hugh Grosvenor now is whether effectiveness justifies existence. Should a system this successful at preserving aristocratic wealth continue in an era that claims to value meritocracy? Can you be ethically progressive while maintaining structurally aristocratic wealth? Hugh seems to think so. He's trying to be the progressive duke, investing in affordable housing, acknowledging his unearned privilege, using wealth for social impact. But he's also maintaining every legal structure that concentrates wealth in his bloodline. Some see this as hypocrisy. Others see it as pragmatic progressivism, using an unjust system to create just outcomes. The truth is probably somewhere between. What's undeniable is that the Grosvenor model, legal protection plus professional management plus patient capital, remains the most successful wealth preservation strategy in modern history. It survived wars, revolutions, economic crashes, tax policy changes, and social transformations that destroyed countless other fortunes. And unless Britain fundamentally restructures property law or inheritance rules, the Grosvenor fortune will likely survive another 300 years, not because future dukes will be brilliant, but because the system doesn't require brilliance. It just requires not actively destroying what previous generations built. That might be the most profound insight. Building wealth requires talent and luck. Preserving wealth just requires not being stupid. And the Grosvenors built a legal structure that makes stupidity irrelevant. So the question remains, is this a model to admire for its effectiveness or to condemn for its inequality? Should we celebrate dynastic wealth preservation as an art form, or should we dismantle the legal structures that make it possible? I don't have the answer, but I know the Grosvenors aren't losing sleep over the question. They're too busy collecting rent on 300 acres of London,